The high chamber of the Synod of the United Voids was not a place built for comfort, but for the articulation of existential dread. Its architecture, a dizzying verticality of spun osmium and psychic crystal, was designed to remind every seated delegate of the incomprehensible scale of the cosmos they were tasked with governing, and the inherent fragility of the orderly systems they had painstakingly erected over 10,000 cycles of documented history. Within the geometric austerity of the Great Hall, the air itself felt heavy, thick with the unvented exhalations of 1,000 delegates representing a score of major stellar powers, each species modulated to the same low-frequency hum of shared, contained panic. The Viridian, with their naturally bioluminescent dermal folds, usually cast a soft, calming azure glow across their diplomatic cluster, but tonight the light pulsed with an anxious, erratic orange, mirroring the collective tension. At the epicenter of the chamber, the raised dais of the Cathar Elder Precept, Xylos, stood as a monument to cold, logical stability, though even Xylos' triple-lensed ocular structures seemed to focus with an unusual intensity on the holographic projection shimmering malevolently at the chamber's center. The object of their focus was designated the sarcophagus-glass anomaly, or, more colloquially in the lower tiers of the Synod, the Dreadhull. It was a vessel of impossible age, not merely ancient, but possessing a temporal signature so distorted that its construction materials seemed to defy the known physics of atomic cohesion, appearing as both fully solid and partially phased from reality. It had been found in the extreme galactic fringe, orbiting a system officially classified as K-15 Omega, an undisputed Class 15 death world. The Cathar had always considered the K-15 classification a theoretical maximum, a designation reserved for planets where the environmental hostility was so total that the very concept of emergent, sentient life was deemed statistically impossible, a statistical error of planetary evolution. Yet the Dreadhull existed, and its presence, its sheer, terrifying artifact of reality, was a repudiation of their 10 millennia of predictive models. The vessel's design philosophy was entirely dedicated to the generation of kinetic null fields and the focused annihilation of any discernible biological signature, lacking any discernible means of propulsion, sustenance, or internal habitation, suggesting it was less a ship and more a sentinel, a weaponized tomb orbiting a grave. The very fact that something had been required to build a weapon of such absolute lethality on a world deemed uninhabitable was the single greatest source of the Synod's unease, suggesting an unknown predator that defied categorization. Elder Precept Xylos extended a primary sensory limb, its segmented chitin clicking softly against the polished plasteel of the dais, a sound amplified to resonate across the silent chamber, a signal that the moment for internal reflection had ceased. "The projections remain unchanged," Xylos stated, its voice a synthesized monotone that stripped away all emotional variance, leaving only the bare, crystalline structure of the data. The sarcophagus-glass anomaly possesses a residual power signature capable of rendering a Sector 4 quadrant inhospitable to hegemony life forms for at least 3 documented cycles. It is a contagion of pure kinetic intent. Its trajectory, even in its current dormant state, must be accounted for. The Elder Precept allowed the silence to draw out, letting the weight of the potential cataclysm settle upon the gathered intellects. The Cathar doctrine was simple: contain, isolate, and neutralize any threat that defied the predictable vectors of galactic conflict. The Dreadhull defied all three. Its threat profile was not military but ontological. From the cluster of the Gnarl, a species known for their serpentine caution and mastery of deep space gravitational physics, Delegate Saris extended a sinuous head. "Precept Xylos, the threat is acknowledged. The deployment of the interdiction fleet is the established protocol. The fleet is prepared to initiate a containment field of full-spectrum gravimetric dampening, but the variables have shifted. The secondary intelligence report, the data concerning the Terra Nova species, requires primary focus. The two events, while seemingly disparate, share a geographical nexus that cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence." The gnarled delegate's voice was a low, resonant rumble, designed to vibrate through the floor plates rather than carry through the air. The shifting of focus from the impossible weapon to the newly discovered species was the root of the political tremor running through the Synod. The term Terra Nova was uttered with a careful, measured distaste by the hegemony delegates. Humanity. They had been tracked for less than a single cycle, a species emerging from a tertiary star system classified as a Class 12 world, a marginal, barely survivable environment, but not one reaching the apocalyptic designation of K-15. Their civilization profile was an offense to Cathar systematic logic. Their political systems were a volatile, self-destructive mix of competing doctrines. Their communication methods utilized complex, non-essential emotive language, and their societal structure seemed built entirely upon unpredictable, self-contradictory motivations. The initial hegemony assessment had categorized them as a species of potential low-level nuisance, perhaps suitable for minor trade in raw alloys in 1,000 cycles, but certainly no threat, and certainly no peer. They were, in the hegemony's cold-blooded analysis, too chaotic to be truly powerful. Yet, the coordinates of the sarcophagus-class anomaly intersected directly with the furthest exploratory probes of the Terra Nova species. The hegemony scouts had found the Dreadhull first, established a quarantine perimeter, and then, a mere few decasals later, the Dreadhull had vanished from the surveillance grid. In its place, positioned precisely where the ancient weapon should have resided, was a single, blocky, aesthetically crude vessel of Terra Nova design. Precept Xylos fixed its gaze on the Viridian cluster, the traditional voice of diplomatic inquiry and ethical constraint within the Synod. The Viridian position, Delegate Alara, your sector borders the contested fringe. Your contact protocols were initiated first. Offer the Synod clarity on this species that seems to violate the basic tenets of predictable evolution. Alara, the Viridian envoy, rose slowly, her multiple limbs rippling with soft azure light that only intensified her species' appearance of profound, ancient weariness. Elder Precept, the clarity you seek does not exist within the available data. The Terra Novans are a contradiction. They possess a technological capability that, on paper, is rudimentary: primitive propulsion, reliance on projectile weaponry in certain documented conflicts, and a societal structure that wastes resources on non-essential aesthetics and emotional stabilization protocols. Yet, simultaneously, their long-range sensor technology operates on principles of quantum entanglement that exceed our current theoretical understanding. They appear to have mastered the practical application of fields we are still attempting to model mathematically. Alara paused, the collective tension of the chamber drawing her light to a deep, anxious indigo. Their communication is the most troubling variable. They respond to fear with silence, to aggression with calm logic, and to diplomatic overtures with a profound, almost disconcerting patience. When asked about the sarcophagus anomaly, their single, relayed response was, "The object is no longer a threat. The quarantine is dissolved. Further inquiry is unnecessary." A ripple of frustrated energy passed through the chamber. Such a response was not merely arrogant. It was a violation of the very principles of galactic security. To declare a Class 15 weapon no longer a threat, without offering proof, without engaging in the requisite diplomatic disclosure, was an act of profound self-assurance that bordered on the psychotic. It suggested either a terrifying ignorance of the Dreadhull's capabilities or a power so vast that they deemed the Synod's concerns irrelevant. The Cathar favored the former conclusion. The Viridian, after their brief, puzzling interaction, were beginning to fear the latter. "Ignorance or intent, the result is the same," interjected Delegate Vron, a thick-shelled delegate from the militaristic Thaxian hegemony, their voice a grinding, metallic rasp that spoke of immediate, physical solutions. "They have entered a quarantine zone and appropriated or destroyed an object of paramount galactic security. Their failure to disclose is a declaration of hostile capability. We must deploy a full-spectrum analysis armada, not merely to contain the Dreadhull's residue, but to enforce the protocols of the United Voids upon this primitive, reckless species. The concept of a Class 12 species declaring themselves the arbiters of a Class 15 artifact is an insult to the accumulated knowledge of the hegemony." The Thaxians were always prone to the language of immediate force, but their position resonated deeply within the chamber. The most terrifying aspect of the unknown is often the challenge it poses to the established order. Xylos tilted its head, processing the Thaxians' aggressive logic, but its data processing unit rejected the conclusion. To deploy an armada is to initiate conflict with an unknown variable that has demonstrated the ability to neutralize a multi-cycle security threat with an alarming lack of effort. We know nothing of their true capabilities. Vron. We only know they possess the will to act unilaterally and the competence to achieve the impossible task of silencing. The sarcophagus anomaly. We cannot afford an act of punitive force driven by wounded pride. Xylos activated a secondary, smaller hologram over the dais. It was a close-up image of the human vessel, the Tameses-class patrol cutter, a name that meant nothing to the Synod. It was unadorned, black-hued, and carried no visible heavy weaponry, yet its presence was a silent, monolithic testament to a new, unsettling power. We will dispatch the Arbiter Vigil, a vessel designed for maximum sensor analysis and non-kinetic intercession, captained by a joint Cathar-Viridian team. They will engage the Terranovans in a formal, diplomatic first contact, and they will demand the full, immediate disclosure of the fate of the sarcophagus anomaly. This must be a negotiation based on shared existential risk, not a skirmish based on territorial imperative. The decision was final, a deliberate slowing of the pace, a maneuver designed to buy time for genuine understanding, a concept antithetical to the Cathar's usual speed of action, but a necessary philosophical adjustment in the face of the Terranovans' impossible stillness. The Arbiter Vigil was a masterpiece of collaborative hegemony engineering, a ship whose entire structural integrity was dedicated to the subtle arts of deep space observation and modulated diplomatic projection. It possessed no kinetic weapons beyond a necessary deterrent, and was instead equipped with sensor arrays capable of analyzing space-time distortion down to the Planck length, and a primary communication suite capable of translating, replicating, and understanding the subvocal emotive inflections of several hundred known sentient species. As it approached the coordinates where the sarcophagus-class anomaly had been detected, the atmosphere aboard the bridge was one of surgical, contained anxiety. Commander Sareth, a pragmatic Gnarl with a mastery of nuanced strategic geometry, directed the ship's course, while Advisor Tikel, a Cathar diplomatic processor, supervised the translation matrix, and Ambassador Linnea, a Viridian whose light glowed the color of deep-sea emeralds, prepared for the psychological tightrope of first direct, formal contact. Commander Sareth, the target vessel, is stationary, holding position at the precise gravimetric nexus of the previous anomaly, reported a junior Cathar sensor technician, its voice trembling slightly under the strain of the data. Its power signature is minimal, almost negligible. It is running on what our analysis suggests is a closed-loop geothermal reactor system, a pre-FTL technology. This contradicts the evidence of its advanced quantum sensor capability. The profile is paradoxical. Sareth, his serpentine form coiled around the central command pedestal, felt the familiar tightening in his sensory organs. The contradiction is the point, technician. The Terranovans are a paradox wrapped in an enigma of conflicting data sets. Tikel, prepare the formal diplomatic cipher. Ambassador Linnea, the first words must be an assertion of non-hostile intent and a request for mutual security disclosure, nothing more. Avoid all language that could be construed as political challenge or accusation of protocol violation. This is an exploratory exchange, not an interrogation. Tikel, the Cathar, whose entire existence was dedicated to the analysis of logical consistency, found the situation profoundly offensive to its rational core. Commander, their vessel is a crude box of ablative hull plating and simple magnetic shielding. Their defensive profile is low. We could neutralize their capability with a modulated gravimetric pulse designed for minor asteroid diversion. Their quantum sensing is the only anomalous variable. I recommend we focus the initial inquiry on this specific technological disparity. How can a species relying on thermal reactors achieve quantum entanglement? The Cathar mind struggled against the idea that a species could be simultaneously primitive and advanced. Linnea gently intervened, her voice a soothing low vibration that cut through the technical debate. Tikel, you seek technological consistency. I seek philosophical motivation. Their power source is primitive, yes, but its very nature suggests independence, a detachment from the established galactic reliance on centralized stellar core tapping. This species might not view power generation as a matter of efficiency, but of redundancy and survival. Their logic, while alien, is not necessarily flawed. Commander Sareth, I shall initiate contact with a direct address of shared security, avoiding all mention of the Dreadhull until the required level of rapport is established. We must establish a common ethical ground before discussing the disappearance of a cosmological weapon. The moment of contact arrived with a strange, anticlimactic simplicity. The Arbiter Vigil's communication beam pulsed out, carrying the complex, multi-layered message of peace, authority, and demand for information. The human ship, the Tameses, remained utterly still for a protracted period, a silence that felt more aggressive than any immediate reply. The hegemony crew grew visibly nervous. The prolonged pause suggested either malfunction, confusion, or a deliberate psychological maneuver. Then the response came. It was not the chaotic, emotive babble the Cathar had partially anticipated, but a single, perfectly modulated voice, speaking in a synthesized, universally recognizable diplomatic dialect. The voice was female, utterly devoid of fear, and carried a profound, unsettling weight of responsibility. Hegemony Vessel Arbiter Vigil. This is Patrol Cutter Tameses, operating under the authority of the Federated Systems of Terra Nova. Your communication is received and analyzed. We acknowledge the necessity of mutual security discourse. You may transmit your primary inquiry. We are prepared to offer full disclosure, predicated on the understanding that this exchange is not an interrogation of a subordinate power, but a necessary clarification between peers facing a shared, existential boundary condition. The citation of a shared, existential boundary condition was a phrase that hit the Cathar delegate Tikel like a physical blow. It was an abstract philosophical concept usually reserved for the highest-level academic discussions on galactic entropy, not a first-contact statement from a supposedly primitive species. Ambassador Linnea took the lead, her emerald light brightening slightly, a sign of her diplomatic engagement. Federated Systems of Terra Nova, we acknowledge your status as an independent peer. Our primary inquiry concerns the extreme gravimetric and energetic distortion detected at your current coordinates. This region was under a high-level quarantine designation due to the presence of an artifact of profound, documented danger, an object we refer to as the sarcophagus-class anomaly or the dreadhull. We require immediate, factual confirmation of its current status, and if applicable, the methodology used for its displacement. Linnea's cadence was flawless, the question direct yet respectful. The human voice, identified in the internal matrix as Ambassador Vesper, responded without hesitation, her tone remaining level, professional, and entirely calm. Ambassador Linnea, your inquiry regarding the object is understood. It is essential to clarify the nature of the object and its designation. The sarcophagus-class anomaly was not a weapon, but a warning. Specifically, it was the final, desperate testament of a civilization that perished during the first wave of the very threat it was designed to warn against. This single sentence sent a silent shockwave through the Arbiter Vigil's bridge. A warning? The hegemony had spent a cycle classifying the artifact as an ultimate weapon, a hostile structure of pure destructive capability. The human perspective inverted the entire threat assessment. Vesper continued, preempting the inevitable hegemony rebuttal, her narrative flowing with the cold precision of an internal Cathar data stream. The civilization that constructed the anomaly was pre-hegemony. They did not possess the full suite of predictive physics models required to understand the threat they faced, which they termed the void weeping. Lacking this understanding, they created the anomaly as a self-sustaining kinetic trap, designed to annihilate any species that reached a certain, arbitrary level of energy signature, a level they mistakenly believed was a prerequisite for encountering the void weeping itself. Their logic was that if they could not defeat the threat, they could at least ensure no other developing civilization reached the required technological capability to attract it. Commander Sareth, unable to restrain his strategic mind, cut in, overriding the protocol momentarily. Ambassador Vesper, with respect, the anomaly possessed a kinetic null-field generator. Its primary function was destructive. How can you classify a weapon of indiscriminate annihilation as a warning? Vesper's response was immediate and subtly devastating. Commander Sareth, the distinction is philosophical, not physical. A trap that destroys the unaware is a warning to the cautious. However, your point is conceded. The anomaly's core programming was flawed. Its trigger parameters were far too broad. Had the hegemony interdiction fleet engaged it, the anomaly would have deemed your energy signature a threat and activated its kinetic cascade, wiping out your ships and then, tragically, waiting for the next emergent species. It was a ticking ethical bomb. She paused, and the silence this time was not tension, but profound psychological absorption. We did not displace the anomaly, Commander. We dismantled it. We neutralized its core programming using a focused application of complex adaptive logic designed to exploit the very flaw in its original constructor's limited understanding of onto. Logical necessity. The anomaly is now inert, its components scheduled for deep space disposal. The region is clean, the existential risk posed by the artifact itself has been reduced to zero. We took this action because, in our assessment, the threat of the indiscriminate defense system was greater than the current, active threat of the void weeping itself. This was the first major reveal. Not a fleet, not a super weapon, but a demonstration of an intellectual and ethical capacity the hegemony had never conceptualized. The humans had not fought the Dreadhull, they had solved it, like a malignant mathematical problem, acting entirely without consultation, driven by a self-imposed ethical mandate to protect civilizations they hadn't even formally met. Ambassador Linnea, her light now a vibrant, steady emerald, understood the immense political and psychological gravity of the humans' actions. Ambassador Vesper, your disclosure is unprecedented. The Synod will require a full, technical data stream of the methodology employed for the anomaly's deactivation. But your assessment raises a new, critical concern. You speak of the void weeping, the genuine threat the anomaly was meant to guard against. The Synod requires immediate, full disclosure of the nature of this threat, which you seem to have been monitoring for some time. Linnea used the word monitoring deliberately, a subtle probe to see how long humanity had been aware of this existential danger. Vesper's voice deepened, the professional calm now infused with a measured gravity that hinted at exhaustion beyond the capacity of the hegemony to comprehend. Ambassador Linnea, we welcome the sharing of the technical data. It is currently being encrypted for transmission, requiring a secure quantum link signature. As for the void weeping, the clarification of this threat is the single reason we are engaging in this discourse. It is the shared, existential boundary condition I previously cited. The screen behind Vesper, which had previously only shown a schematic of the small, simple Tameseas patrol cutter, abruptly flickered and was replaced by a vast, incomprehensible star chart. It was not the familiar, three-dimensional representation of the galactic plane used by the hegemony, but a multi-layered, four-dimensional projection that included vectors for ontological decay and temporal drag, concepts the hegemony treated as theoretical impossibilities. The chart showed not stars and nebulae, but vast, sprawling structures that were gaps in reality, regions where the normal rules of physics were slowly dissolving, replaced by a non-causal, entropic framework. The void weeping, Vesper stated, her voice now a clinical instrument of shared horror, is not a species, nor a weapon, nor an environmental disaster in the typical sense. It is the effect of structured, non-random cosmological decay, a progressive entropic wave that targets the fundamental constants of localized spacetime. It manifests as a slow, inevitable dissolution of complexity and information across the universe. It is not an aggressive force. It is a passive, structural failure of reality itself. She magnified a specific section of the map, a region bordering the very edge of the hegemony's explored territories and overlapping with the area previously designated as a benign, empty void. The civilization that built the anomaly encountered the void weeping millennia ago. They did not die in conflict. They simply found that their ability to sustain complex structures, their ships, their power sources, their very biological cohesion, began to fail randomly without cause. Their Class 15 Death World designation was a result of the decay zone overlapping their home system, creating an environment of perpetual, unstable chaos. Their death was slow, terrifying, and silent. They left the anomaly as a desperate, final attempt to ensure no one would follow them into the expanding silence. The implications of this revelation were staggering. The hegemony, in its 10,000 cycles of systematic expansion, had always prepared for conflict with sentient threats, empires, biological weapons, or superior technological forces. They had never considered the possibility of a threat that was simply the undoing of physics itself. The sheer, cold magnitude of the problem caused the Gnarl commander Sareth to visibly recoil, his sophisticated sensor readings confirming that the data Vesper was projecting was mathematically sound, even if the underlying physics were terrifyingly unfamiliar. "Ambassador Vesper," Linnea whispered, her voice reflecting the shock of the Arbiter Vigil crew. "If this phenomenon is of such staggering magnitude, how can your patrol cutter, powered by a geothermal reactor, be operating so close to its influence? Why the reliance on such rudimentary technology in the face of ontological collapse?" Vesper turned her gaze, or what the hegemony scanners interpreted as her point of focus, directly toward the Arbiter Vigil's primary camera. "Ambassador Linnea, this is the core of our disparity and ultimately the foundation of the unity we must forge. You saw a Class 12 species with crude technology and assumed ignorance. You were incorrect. Our survival on a Class 12 world, a world of unpredictable geology, self-replicating viral threats, and volatile atmospheric states, taught us the necessity of robustness over efficiency. When dealing with an entropic force like the void weeping, highly centralized, hyper-efficient power sources become single points of failure. They are too reliant on predictable physical constants that the weeping is actively dissolving. The Tameseas is powered by a geothermal system not out of necessity, but by design. It is redundant, self-sustaining, and utilizes energy principles so basic they are almost immune to the weeping's entropic randomization. Our seeming simplicity is our greatest strength. Our quantum sensor arrays, which so perplexed you, are not designed for offense, but for the preemptive mapping and prediction of the weeping's decay vectors. We do not seek to fight the decay. We seek only to predict the areas of maximum entropy so we can maneuver around them. She paused, and the gravity of her next statement was profound, delivered with a quiet authority that transcended military might. The chaotic democracy you observed in our political structure is not a weakness. It is a feature. It is the only political engine that can adapt and reform quickly enough to survive a threat that is constantly, randomly rewriting the rules of reality. We do not thrive on order, Ambassador. We thrive on resilience. This was the final, devastating reveal of Act 2. Humanity's perceived flaws, their chaos, their contradictory technology, their aggressive survival on a difficult planet were not failures of evolution but highly optimized philosophical responses to an existential threat that had predated their contact with the hegemony by millennia. They were not primitive, they were hardened. They were not chaotic, they were adaptive. They were not arrogant in solving the dreadhull. They were simply demonstrating the practiced competence of a species that had been living on the razor's edge of cosmic dissolution for generations. The Class 15 Death World was not the original home of the anomaly builders. It was a future for any species that failed to prepare. And humanity, without knowing it, had already been preparing for that future. The return of the Arbiter Vigil to the hegemony's central space was not marked by fanfare, but by a sudden, chilling silence that permeated the Synod of the United Voids. Elder Precept Xylos listened to the full, unedited recording of Ambassador Vesper's disclosure. The Cathar's immense, complex logic centers struggling to reconcile 10,000 cycles of ordered galactic history with the single, horrifying truth of structured entropic decay. The data stream on the dismantling of the sarcophagus-class anomaly was simultaneously simple and utterly baffling. The humans had used an array of low-power, targeted resonance frequencies to confuse the anomaly's core processor, tricking it into initiating a diagnostic shutdown instead of a kinetic discharge. It was not a show of power, but an exercise in intellectual judo, a capability that required an understanding of alien logic and ethical systems that the hegemony, in its sheer monolithic order, had forgotten it possessed. The Terra Nova species has not merely solved a problem of security, delegates, Xylos stated, its voice for the first time tinged with a carefully controlled tremor. They have solved a problem of philosophy. They saw a device of ultimate, indiscriminate defense and understood that its true threat was its lack of ethical oversight. They acted not on behalf of their own species, but on behalf of all potential victims of a flawed premise. The Cathar mind, which prioritized efficiency and self-preservation, found this concept of preemptive, self-imposed ethical defense to be a terrifying display of strength. It meant humanity possessed a moral compass that was not self-serving, but universal. Delegate Vron of the Thaxian hegemony, his metallic voice less aggressive now, more profoundly troubled, rose to address the dais. Precept Xylos, the threat of the void weeping is mathematically confirmed by our deep scan analysts. Ambassador Vesper's data projection of the entropic decay vectors is consistent with our own previously dismissed fringe observations. We categorized the anomalies as statistical noise. The Terra Novans categorized them as an existential frontier. We were arrogant. We were blind. The question now is not about the nature of the threat, but the nature of the alliance. Ambassador Vesper stated her disclosure was predicated on a shared, existential boundary condition. What, precisely, does the Terra Nova species demand in return for this? Knowledge and, crucially, for the technical means to track this decay. Xylos directed the question to Ambassador Linnea, who was still recovering from the direct sensory input of the Tameseas contact. Linnea, what was the human ambassador's position on reciprocity? Did she demand territory, resources, technological sharing. Linea's emerald light was now steady, imbued with a new, profound respect. Precept Xylos, the ambassador, demanded nothing. Her request was a statement of strategic necessity, not a diplomatic negotiation. She stated that the void weeping is not a localized threat. It is a cosmological event that requires a coordinated, pangalactic response utilizing all available resources. She requested that the hegemony utilize its vast, centralized logistical power, the very efficiency we pride ourselves upon, to begin the rapid implementation of specific, counter-entropic resource stockpiling and the construction of long-range, geothermal redundant orbital refuges along the predicted decay vectors. The resources she requests are not for them, delegates, Linea emphasized, her voice rising to carry the weight of the moment. The materials, the rare isotopes, the specialized alloy composites, the mass-produced, simplified geothermal units, are for the construction of a shared, emergency infrastructure designed to shelter all vulnerable species within the hegemony's sphere of influence when the decay reaches critical mass. They demand nothing but our commitment to the collective survival of the organized galaxy. They have been managing this crisis in isolation for generations, and they are now asking the organized galaxy to assume its share of the burden, not to act as a subordinate, but as a stabilizing force. The profound realization settled over the chamber like a shroud. The species they had categorized as chaotic, primitive, and self-serving were, in fact, operating on a level of ethical and strategic altruism that shamed the hegemony's self-interest. The humans did not see the hegemony as a potential threat to be managed, but as a crucial, stable resource to be utilized in the service of galactic preservation. Their power was not the ability to destroy, but the moral authority to demand collective survival. Xylos processed the data. The Cathar civilization had always been defined by its rigid logic, its search for order, its relentless drive towards ultimate efficiency. Yet in the face of true cosmic randomness, efficiency was a weakness. The human model, redundancy, resilience, and a chaotic yet adaptive political structure was the true survival mechanism. Delegates, Xylos proclaimed, the word echoing with the newfound weight of shared destiny. The formal alliance with the federated systems of Terra Nova is hereby ratified, contingent upon the immediate, full implementation of Ambassador Vesper's strategic requests. The hegemony is now a logistical partner in a cosmological conflict. We have spent 10,000 cycles looking outward for physical threats. We failed to look inward for philosophical threats. The Terra Novans have provided us with the necessary vision. The Synod, humbled and unified by a fear far greater than any internal political squabble, moved with a sudden, coordinated speed. The vast logistical networks of the hegemony, its fleet movements, its resource allocation, its industrial centers, were instantly redirected to the single, massive task of building the pangalactic survival network the humans required. The Thaxian fleet, instead of preparing for an interdiction, began preparing for massive, coordinated supply runs into the deep void, guided by the newly shared human predictive decay maps. The Viridian, masters of biological and psychological stability, began disseminating the human data on entropic resilience, teaching the myriad species under the hegemony's umbrella how to build small, local, self-sustaining power systems, the very geothermal redundancy that had seemed so primitive. The fear was still present, but it was now tempered by the resolute, quiet competence of their new, unexpected allies. Cycles passed, marked not by political debate, but by the steady, unrelenting progress of construction. The alliance between the hegemony and the federated systems of Terra Nova, now formally known as the Covenant of Resilience, was an alliance of necessity, built on shared dread and mutual professional respect. Ambassador Vesper, now a fixture within the Synod's command structure, moved through the grand osmium chamber not with the air of a diplomat, but with the weary focus of a field general whose theater of war was the entire universe. She never raised her voice, never engaged in unnecessary rhetoric, and never displayed a moment of doubt, a calm that resonated powerfully with the Cathar's desire for certainty. The Synod had finally fully understood the psychological depth of humanity. They were not calm because they were safe, but calm despite. The terror. Their historical reliance on a mix of logic and sheer emotional tenacity was not a flaw, but a necessary psychological tool for survival against a foe that offered no hope of victory, only the opportunity for prolonged, meaningful resistance. One rotation, As the implementation of the human-designed long-range surveillance infrastructure neared completion, Ambassador Vesper requested a closed-door high-level conference with only Elder Precept Xylos, Commander Sareth, and Ambassador Linnea present, the triumvirate who had witnessed the first contact. The meeting was held in a small, secure antechamber, far from the grand theater of the Synod. Elder Precept, Vesper began, her gaze steady, the initial phase of the Covenant is complete. The early warning system is fully deployed, and the resource stockpiling is at the required minimum threshold for the predicted zone beta decay. The hegemony's response has been efficient and beyond expectation. Your capacity for unified logistical action is, as we predicted, your greatest strength. Xylos acknowledged the compliment with a slight, almost imperceptible shift of its sensory limbs. Ambassador Vesper, the hegemony is humbled by the scope of this threat, and profoundly respectful of the quiet fortitude your species has demonstrated. However, a question remains, a point of philosophical divergence. You have provided us with the means to track the weeping and the means to survive the initial wave, but you have provided no means to fight it. Is this a conflict of pure avoidance? Is there no point in the entire cosmos where the decay is reversible? Vesper regarded Xylos for a long moment, a silence that carried the weight of all the untold, necessary secrets of her species. Precept Xylos, the void weeping, as I stated, is not a force of aggression. It is a slow, structural failure of reality. When an organized system collapses, you cannot fight the collapse. You can only work to stabilize the remaining structure. That has been our philosophy. She moved to the central projection table and activated a complex, entirely new star map. This map was unlike any the hegemony had ever seen. It was not a projection of the current physical galaxy, nor of the decay zones, but a deep-time map of the original, pre-weeping cosmos, overlaid with markers indicating civilizations that had risen and collapsed long before the Cathar had emerged from their home world. But humanity, Vesper continued, her voice gaining a new, resonant intensity, cannot abide a conflict of pure avoidance. We were born on a world of ceaseless, chaotic struggle, and we learned that even in the face of inevitable destruction, there must be a final, meaningful action. Our resilience is not just our ability to survive the unknown, it is our capacity to engage with it. She magnified one point on the map, a coordinate deep in the intergalactic void, far beyond the reach of any hegemony or human scout probe, a region so distant it was generally considered to be non-existent. At that point, a single, impossibly vast structure was indicated, a geometric shape of non-Euclidean complexity, an object that dwarfed even the theoretical calculations of a Dyson swarm. We did not tell you everything, Precept, Vesper stated, her eyes locked on Xylos. The dread hull, the sarcophagus-class anomaly, was the warning left by the first civilization to encounter the weeping. But there was a second civilization, one that followed centuries later, a civilization that studied the weeping not as a threat, but as an equation. This structure, Vesper gestured to the projection, we call it the ethel core. It is an abandoned megastructure, a cosmological construct of impossible scale left by that second species. They realized that the void weeping was an entropic wave, yes, but they also realized that every wave must have a point of origin, a zero-point anomaly from which the decay began to spread. They hypothesized that the only way to slow the cosmological collapse was not to run from the entropic decay, but to somehow influence the origin point of the entropic event itself. Commander Sareth, the Gnarl strategist, broke his silence, his voice a low, guttural inquiry. An origin point? Ambassador, the entropic decay of the universe is a process, not a location. That is scientifically impossible. Not impossible, Commander, merely incomprehensible through standard physics, Vesper countered calmly. The weeping began at a specific point in deep time, a singular event that resulted in the propagation of this decay. The second civilization believed that if they could construct a massive, counter-entropic resonator at that theoretical point, they could, if not reverse the wave, at least dampen it significantly, buying the rest of the cosmos billions of cycles of stabilized time. Vesper took a deep breath, the human gesture conveying a profound, weary determination that transcended language. They failed to see. Complete the ethel core. The weeping reached them before they could activate the structure. They vanished, leaving behind only the partially built core, a colossal monument to a grand, necessary failure. She looked at the three alien leaders, her gaze holding the collected weight of human history and all its stubborn, illogical hope. The greatest secret of the federated systems of Terra Nova is not our technology, nor our resilience, but our commitment to their failure. For millennia, operating silently beyond the scope of any hegemony sensor, every human exploration, every major human scientific endeavor has been secretly directed toward one task: completing the ethel core. Our advanced quantum sensors were not just for tracking the weeping, but for navigating the chaotic physics required to reach that impossible coordinate. Our geothermal redundancy was designed to sustain life on ships that must eventually operate in the utter random entropy of the pre-decay core region. The ultimate truth was revealed. Humanity's entire civilization, its chaos, its genius, its stubborn survival, had been secretly directed toward fulfilling the failed prophecy of a long-dead second civilization. They had inherited a cosmic debt and had been silently working to pay it forward, without fanfare, without reward, driven only by the terrifying logic of the necessity of meaningful action in the face of universal collapse. They had found a dangerous mission from a Class 15-level crisis, and humanity was already there, deeply embedded in the millennia-long effort to solve it. The hegemony's logistical power, your stability, your ability to rapidly resource and mobilize, Vesper concluded, her voice a final, solemn declaration, is not needed for survival alone, Precept. It is needed to construct the final activation component for the ethel core. The Covenant of Resilience is not a defensive alliance. It is the mobilization for a final, impossible act of cosmological engineering. The chamber was plunged into a silence deeper than the void itself. Elder Precept Xylos felt the cold, hard logic of the Cathar mind finally dissolve under the pressure of this immense, selfless revelation. The humans were not just their peers. They were the guardians of a universal, terrifying burden, a burden they had chosen to bear alone until the moment of critical mobilization. Xylos slowly extended a primary limb, not in a gesture of command, but of profound existential respect. Ambassador Vesper, it stated, its voice synthesized but carrying a weight of newly understood emotion. The hegemony bows to the philosophical depth of your species. You have shown us that the ultimate form of power is not the ability to survive, but the willingness to commit to the impossible task of ensuring a future for the entire cosmos, even if that task demands everything and promises nothing. The Covenant of Resilience is hereby expanded. The logistical might of the United Voids is now entirely at your disposal. Tell us what is needed, Ambassador. Tell us how to construct the final piece of the ethel core, and the hegemony will dedicate every cycle of its existence to the completion of this final, desperate, and profoundly human action. The chamber, usually a place of geometric order and logical debate, felt suddenly vast and open, its spun osmium structure no longer a reflection of contained dread, but a symbol of the immense, shared labor to come. The initial fear of the Class 15 death world had given way to the terrifying realization of the cosmos's true, silent enemy. And the arrogance toward the chaotic, primitive humans had dissolved into an awe-filled respect for the species that was already standing guard, quietly building the last great hope for a dying universe. The hegemony had sought an ally. They had found a shepherd, guiding them toward the final, great frontier, the defiant, hopeful completion of a structure designed to push back the silence, not with violence, but with a singular, beautiful act of cosmic engineering, driven by the simple, enduring, and terrifying tenacity of the human spirit. The long journey had just begun.